The old man sat on the porch as the Arizona sun painted the horizon in shades of copper and gold. His hands, weathered and scarred, rested on the arms of a wooden rocking chair that had seen 40 summers. At 88 years old, Jacob Thornton had outlived most men of his generation, outlived the century itself in some ways. But memory, that cruel and faithful companion, kept every moment sharp as the day had happened. His grandson Thomas stood by the railing, a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. 16 years old and restless, the boy had that look young men get when they think the world beyond the horizon holds more promise than the ground beneath their feet. "I don't understand why you cling to this place, Grandpa," Thomas said, his voice carrying that particular impatience of youth. "It's 1923. People make their fortunes with their minds now, not their backs." Jake's eyes, still sharp despite his years, drifted across the land he'd defended with blood and love. The silence stretched between them like a gulf of years. Then he spoke, his voice rough as desert wind over stone. "Sit down, boy. There's a story you need to hear before you make up your mind about leaving." Thomas hesitated, then lowered himself onto the porch steps. Something in his grandfather's tone commanded attention. "Back in 1883, 40 years ago now, I thought just like you," Jake began. "Thought this land was nothing but dust and disappointment. Then a woman taught me different. Taught me that sometimes what we're protecting isn't the dirt under our feet. It's something bigger, something called honor." "Grandma Sarah?" Thomas asked. Jake nodded slowly. "Before she became my wife, before she became your grandmother, she said something to me that changed my whole life. 7 words. Save me, 3 times a day. Sounds simple enough, doesn't it? But those 7 words held a promise that would test everything I thought I knew about being a man." The old man's gaze grew distant, traveling back through 4 decades to a younger version of himself. "You want to know why this land matters? Then listen. And maybe when I'm done, you'll understand what's worth fighting for." July 1883. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of sand and scrub brush baking under a sun that showed no mercy. Temperature climbed past 112 degrees, the kind of heat that made men question their sanity for living in such a place. The air shimmered with waves of thermal distortion, turning the distant mountains into wavering mirages. Jake Thornton, 48 years old and weathered by a decade of solitude, guided his mare Duchess along the trail from Tombstone back to his ranch. 18 miles of nothing but heat and rock and the occasional cry of a circling hawk. He'd sold 3 horses that morning, good money that would see him through winter. The leather saddlebags carried $200 in silver coins, heavy and reassuring against the horse's flank. He'd been a cavalryman once, fought in the war between the states, then spent another 11 years chasing Apache raiders through these same mountains. He knew this country the way some men knew the lines on their own palms. Every canyon, every water source, every place where a man could take cover or make a stand. His wife Rebecca had died 10 years back. Typhoid fever took her in 3 days, left him with an empty house in a silence so profound it felt like drowning. No children, just him and the land and the horses he broke for a living. He'd learned to live with loneliness the way men learn to live with old wounds. You don't heal exactly, you just get used to the ache. Half a mile ahead, something caught his eye, a vertical shape where nothing vertical should be. At first glance, it looked like a scarecrow, or maybe some kind of Apache warning post. But scarecrows don't exist in the middle of the desert. And as Duchess plodded closer, Jake heard something that made his blood run cold. A scream, weak and desperate, barely human. He kicked the mare into a gallop. Dust exploded behind him as Duchess surged forward, her powerful legs eating up the distance. The shape resolved itself into horrible clarity. A woman, bound to a wooden cross under the killing sun. Jake hauled back on the reins 20 feet away, dismounting before Duchess had fully stopped. His boots hit the sand, and he was running, his cavalry training overriding shock. Assess, act, save. She hung from ropes that cut deep into her wrists. Her skin had blistered and cracked like old leather. Her dress, once blue cotton, was stained dark with sweat and dust. Her lips were split and bleeding, her eyes half closed against the glare. But she was breathing. Barely. Jake pulled his Bowie knife from its sheath and cut the ropes, catching her as she fell. She weighed almost nothing, hollowed out by 2 days without water. Her skin burned with fever, radiating heat like a stove. "Please," she whispered, the words scraping out of her ruined throat. "Water." Jake carried her to Duchess, laid her in the shade of the horse's body, and pulled his canteen. 10 years in the cavalry had taught him the protocol for severe dehydration. Too much water too fast could kill her as surely as none at all. He tilted the canteen and let 2 ounces trickle into her mouth. She choked, coughed, but managed to swallow. Her eyes opened wider, focusing on his face with desperate intensity. "Who did this?" Jake demanded, keeping his voice gentle despite the rage building in his chest. Her fingers clutched at his shirt with surprising strength. "Cross," she gasped. "Nathaniel Cross. He wants to marry me. I said no, so he left me here to change my mind." Jake's jaw tightened. He knew the name. Everyone in Cochise County knew Nathaniel Cross, owned half of Wilcox, controlled the other half with money and bullets. "I'm getting you to safety," Jake said, lifting her carefully onto Duchess's saddle. But she grabbed his face with both hands, forcing him to look directly into her bloodshot, wild eyes. The fever made them bright as broken glass. "Save me," she whispered, her voice stronger now, urgent with desperation. "Save me and I'll give you anything. 3 times a day. Every day, I promise. Save me from Cross and I'm yours, morning, noon, and night." Jake froze. The meaning of her words hit him like a fist. This wasn't gratitude. This was a transaction. A bargain struck in the currency of flesh because she had nothing else left to trade. "You don't know what you're saying," Jake muttered, looking away. "I know exactly what I'm saying," she insisted, her cracked fingers digging into his arm with fierce determination. "I don't have money. I don't have land. All I have is me, and I'm choosing where I belong. I'm choosing who touches me. Not Cross, you. That's my choice." For a long moment, Jake couldn't speak. He was 48 years old. He'd been alone for a decade, breaking horses and avoiding people. He was no saint, but he wasn't the kind of man who took advantage of a dying woman either. But the way she looked at him, not with shame, with defiance, like this deal was her weapon, her way of taking control when everything else had been ripped away. Jake swallowed hard and nodded once. "Let's get you home first, then we'll talk." He lifted her onto Duchess and climbed up behind her, one arm circling her waist to keep her steady. Her body burned like a furnace against his chest. He figured she had maybe 12 hours before her system just gave up. Maybe less. As his ranch came into view 5 miles distant, Jake felt the full weight of what he'd just agreed to, or rather, what he hadn't refused. The line between the two suddenly seemed razor thin. One question burned in his mind louder than the desert sun. Would saving her life cost him his soul? The ranch house sat alone in a shallow valley, surrounded by scrub oak and mesquite. Nothing fancy. 3 rooms built from pine logs, a roof of clay tiles, and a porch that faced east to catch the morning sun. Behind it stood the horse barn, a storage shed for hay, and a small bunkhouse where Miguel Rodriguez lived. Miguel was Jake's only employee, a Mexican ranch hand who'd worked for him 5 years. Good with horses, better with a rifle, and loyal to a fault. When Jake rode in carrying an unconscious woman, Miguel was there in seconds. "Dios mío," Miguel breathed, seeing the condition she was in. "What happened?" "Found her tied up in the desert, 2 days without water." Jake dismounted carefully, keeping Sarah's limp body cradled against his chest. "Get me clean cloth, cool water, and that salt mixture we used during the Apache campaigns." Miguel nodded and ran. Jake carried the woman inside and laid her on his own bed, the only decent mattress in the house. Her breathing came shallow and rapid, her skin flushed dangerously red despite the relative cool of the house's interior. He'd seen men die from heat stroke during the war. Knew the signs, knew she was right on the edge of that final cliff. Miguel returned with supplies. Together they worked with the efficiency of old soldiers, cool cloths on her forehead, neck, and wrists. The salt and sugar solution fed to her spoonful by spoonful every 15 minutes. They cut away her ruined dress and covered her with a sheet dampened with well water. All through that first night, Jake sat beside the bed. He'd done this before, 10 years ago, watching Rebecca slip away despite everything he tried. The memory sat on his shoulders like a weight made of lead and regret. "I won't let another one die," he whispered to the darkness. "Not in my hands. Not again." Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness. Once she opened her eyes and looked directly at him. "Thank you," she managed. "Save your strength," Jake replied. But she wasn't done. "3 times a day. I meant it. That's my promise." Then she was gone again, pulled under by fever and exhaustion. Miguel stood in the doorway, concern etched deep in his weathered face. "Patron, what did she say?" Jake shook his head. "She's delirious. Doesn't know what she's saying." But he knew it was a lie even as he spoke it. Her eyes had been too clear, too focused. She knew exactly what she'd offered. The question was whether he was man enough to refuse. Dawn came slowly, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and orange. Jake had dozed in the chair beside the bed, jerking awake every time Sarah's breathing changed. Miguel had taken over the watch at 3 in the morning, but Jake couldn't leave. Something kept him rooted there, some instinct that said she needed him close. As light filtered through the window, he made a decision. "Miguel, I'm riding into Wilcox. Keep watch over her. Don't let anyone near this ranch." Miguel's eyes narrowed. "You think Cross will come?" "I don't know, but I'm not taking chances." Jake saddled Duchess in the pre-dawn darkness and rode hard for Wilcox. 12 miles across open desert, pushing the mare faster than he should. But time mattered now. Every hour that passed was an hour Cross might use to cover his tracks or make his next move. The town was just waking up when Jake thundered in. He tied Duchess outside the Western Union office and waited for it to open at 6 sharp. The operator, a thin man named Harrison, looked surprised to see anyone so early. "Need to send a telegram," Jake said without preamble. "Urgent, to U.S. Marshal Henry Garrett in Tucson." Harrison pulled out a form. "Go ahead." Jake dictated slowly, making sure every word counted. "To Marshal H. Garrett, Tucson. From J. Thornton, Cochise County. Date 15th July 1883. Urgent, rescued young woman abandoned in desert 2 days. Suspect Nathaniel Cross of Wilcox. Crime attempted murder. Require immediate investigation. Living witness available. Jacob Thornton, former lieutenant, Company E, 3rd Cavalry." Harrison's eyes widened as he copied it down. "Mr. Thornton, this is serious business. You sure about this?" "Dead sure. How much?" $2.50. Jake counted out the coins from his saddlebag. Money he'd just earned selling horses, now spent on justice. Or revenge. The line between them seemed unclear. Next, he went to the general store and bought paper, envelope, and stamps. Sat down at a barrel outside and wrote for 30 minutes straight. 6 pages detailing everything. Where he'd found Sarah, her condition, her accusation against Cross, a request for Marshal Garrett to investigate Cross for prior crimes, including a woman named Martha Collins who died in the desert 2 years ago. He sealed the letter, marked it express mail, and paid an extra $1.25 to ensure it went out on the next stage. By the time he rode back to his ranch, the sun stood high and merciless. He'd been gone for hours. Part of him expected to find Cross's men waiting, but the ranch sat quiet under the heat, exactly as he'd left it. Miguel met him at the door. "She woke up, Patron. Asked for you." Jake's heart kicked harder than it should. He stepped inside, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness. Sarah sat propped up on pillows, still pale but noticeably stronger. A cup of broth sat on the bedside table, half empty. Her eyes tracked him as he entered, and this time they were clear. Fever broken. "You're the man who found me," she said. Her voice was rough as sandpaper but steady. "What's your name?" "Jake Thornton. This is my ranch." "I'm Sarah Mitchell." She paused, gathering courage. "I told you my father owes Nathaniel Cross money. That's why he wanted to marry me. But there's more you should know." Jake pulled the chair closer. "I'm listening." What came next was a story that made his blood run cold. Not just a tale of debt and coercion, but a carefully constructed trap that had been years in the making. Sarah's father, Daniel, had been a small rancher, struggling but honest. 2 years ago, his cattle had fallen sick with some mysterious disease, nearly wiped out his herd. He'd borrowed $2,500 from Cross at what seemed like reasonable terms, 10% interest. But the loan documents, which Daniel had signed without reading carefully, actually specified 40% annual interest, compounded monthly. By the time Daniel realized the truth, he owed over $5,000, and Cross had made his offer. Marry off Sarah to clear the debt with $5,000 extra to rebuild the ranch. My father was terrified, Sarah said, tears streaming down her face now. Cross's men came to our house at midnight, dragged my father to Cross's mansion, told him he had 1 week to deliver me or lose everything. And you? Jake asked quietly. I said no. I'm 25 years old, Mr. Thornton. Old enough to choose my own path. So Cross decided to break me the old-fashioned way. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. He invited the whole town to a party. 200 people. In front of all of them, he got down on one knee and proposed. Offered me a diamond ring worth $3,000. Jake could picture it. The public spectacle, designed to force her hand through shame and social pressure. What did you do? Sarah's eyes hardened. I said no. I told him I didn't love him, and I would never marry a man who tried to buy people like they were cattle. Then I walked out. That must have cost him. More than you know, Nathaniel Cross had never been refused anything in his life. For a woman to reject him publicly, in front of the entire town, she shook her head. 2 days later, 3 of his men grabbed me on my way home from the schoolhouse, took me out to the desert. Cross was waiting there with a wooden cross already built. Her voice went flat, reciting facts without emotion. The only way to get through it. He gave me one last chance, agree to marry him or die in the desert. I chose death, so he tied me up and left. Said he'd come back in 3 days to see if I'd changed my mind, if I was still alive. Jake felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. He'd seen cruelty during the war, seen men do terrible things to other men, but this calculated torture, this psychological breaking of another human being, struck him as worse somehow, more personal, more evil. That's when I made my decision, Sarah continued, looking directly at him now. If I survived, if someone found me, I would never let anyone own me again. Not Cross, not my father, not anyone. But I also knew I couldn't fight Cross alone. He has 12 armed men. He owns the sheriff. The law won't touch him. She leaned forward, intense despite her weakness. So when you found me, when you saved my life, I made you an offer. 3 times a day. It sounds crude, doesn't it? Sounds like something a desperate woman says when she's half dead. But I meant every word, Mr. Thornton. And I'm saying it again now, completely clear-headed. Save me from Cross, protect me, and I'm yours. That's the deal. Jake stood up and walked to the window. The honest thing, the right thing, would be to refuse. Tell her she didn't owe him anything. Tell her to rest and heal, and then he'd help her anyway because it was the decent thing to do. But he'd already sent the telegram, already written the letter, already committed himself to standing between her and Cross. And if he was honest with himself, some part of him had been dead for 10 years. Some part of him wanted this. Not the physical arrangement. That was just the terms of the deal. What he wanted was simpler and more complicated at the same time. He wanted to matter to someone again. I went to Wilcox this morning, he said, not turning around. Sent a telegram to U.S. Marshal Henry Garrett in Tucson. He was my commanding officer during the Apache campaigns. Good man, honest. I told him everything you told me, asked him to investigate Cross. The silence behind him stretched so long, he finally turned around. Sarah was staring at him with an expression he couldn't read. You did that already, she whispered. Before we even talked? It was the right thing to do. So you don't need me to keep my promise. You'd already decided to help me. Her voice cracked. Then why did you let me offer? Jake crossed back to the chair and sat down. For a long moment, he just looked at her, this fierce, broken, brave young woman who'd chosen death over submission. Because you needed to offer, he said finally. You needed to feel like you had control over something. After what Cross did, after what your father almost did, you needed to choose. And I respect that choice. But Sarah, you should know something. I'm not doing this for your promise. I'm doing it because it's right. And if you want to keep that promise anyway, I won't say no. But you don't owe me. You never will. For the first time since he'd found her, Sarah smiled. It was small and fragile, but genuine. 3 days, she said. Give me 3 days to get my strength back. Then we'll see if you still think I don't owe you anything. Over the next 72 hours, Sarah transformed from half dead to merely exhausted. Jake had seen men bounce back from the edge before, had seen what the human body could endure and survive. But watching her recover was different somehow, more personal. Miguel brought food at regular intervals, broth made from beef bones on the first day, soft bread and eggs on the second. By the third day, Sarah was eating regular meals and walking around the cabin without assistance. She talked while she healed, filling the silence with stories of her life. Her mother had died when Sarah was 12. Pneumonia took her in winter, leaving Sarah to run the household while her father worked the ranch. She taught herself to read from her mother's books, then got a position teaching at the Wilcox School for Girls when she turned 20. $35 a month, which she gave to her father to help keep the ranch afloat. I thought if I worked hard enough, saved enough, we'd be okay, she said. I didn't know about the debt until 6 months ago. Didn't know what Cross had done to our cattle until later. What did he do? Jake asked. Sarah's face hardened. Poison them, Miguel told me. Said Cross has done it before. Pours arsenic into the water sources. Kills the livestock, ruins the rancher, then buys the land for pennies on the dollar. Jake made a mental note of that. Another crime to add to the list. Another reason Marshal Garrett needed to act fast. On the evening of the third day, as the sun set in a blaze of red and gold, Sarah came out to the porch where Jake sat smoking his pipe. She wore one of his old shirts, far too large for her, hanging past her knees like a dress. She sat down beside him, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she'd used to wash, close enough to feel the warmth of her body in the cooling evening air. 3 days, she said quietly, like I promised. Jake set down his pipe. Sarah, you're not obligated. I know, she interrupted. That's exactly why I want to do this. You didn't ask, you just saved me. And now I need to feel safe. I need to feel like I have control over something, anything, and I need... She paused, searching for words. I need to replace bad memories with good ones. Jake looked at her sharply. What do you mean? Her hands clenched in her lap. Cross didn't just threaten me, Mr. Thornton. At that party, when I rejected him, he grabbed me, kissed me in front of everyone. Later, after I ran outside, he followed me, put his hands on me, whispered things. I pushed him away, but I can still feel it, still hear his voice in my ear, and I want to erase that. Replace it with the touch of someone I trust, someone I chose. Do you understand? And God help him, he did. This wasn't about gratitude or payment. This was about reclaiming her own body, her own choices, her own autonomy after Cross had tried to steal all three. If that's what you need, Jake said carefully, then I'll help you, but on one condition. What? You tell me to stop if you change your mind. Anytime. For any reason. This is your choice, which means you get to keep choosing every single time. Understood? Sarah nodded, and for the first time since he'd found her, something like peace settled over her features. That night, she came to his room just after dawn. The sky was barely light, the world still quiet. Jake was awake, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, when he heard the door open. She stood in the doorway wearing that oversized shirt. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders. Her bare feet made no sound on the wooden floor. Good morning, she said softly. Morning, Jake replied, sitting up. His heart hammered in his chest like he was 18 instead of 48. This is the first time, Sarah said, closing the door behind her, of 3 times today, if you're willing. Jake studied her face, looking for any sign of doubt or fear. Found none. Just determination and something that might have been hope. Are you sure? He asked. I'm sure. We can wait. You're still healing. I'm sure, she repeated, and crossed to the bed. What happened next was tender and careful and nothing like Jake had imagined. Sarah cried afterward, but when he asked if he'd heard her, she shook her head. No, she whispered. These are good tears. Relief, I think. For the first time in months, I feel like my body belongs to me again. They lay together as the sun rose, and Jake felt something crack open in his chest, some frozen place that had been locked up tight for 10 years. Thank you, Sarah murmured against his shoulder. For what? For giving me back to myself. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt almost normal, almost peaceful. Sarah kept her promise religiously. 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night, she came to Jake. But between those times, life on the ranch continued. Jake taught her to care for horses, showed her how to brush them properly, how to check their hooves for stones, how to measure out oats and hay. Sarah learned quickly, asking questions and remembering answers. On the 5th day, Jake decided it was time for another lesson. He set up 6 empty bean cans on the fence rail behind the house, led Sarah out there carrying his Colt 45. If cross comes, you need to be able to defend yourself, he said. The revolver looked enormous in her small hands. Jake stood behind her, positioned her stance, showed her how to sight down the barrel. His arms circled hers, helping support the weight. Don't jerk the trigger, he instructed. Squeeze it, nice and steady. The first shot kicked the gun up and nearly knocked Sarah backward. Jake steadied her, his hands on her shoulders. Again, he said, get used to the recoil. Let it happen instead of fighting it. They practiced for 2 hours. By the end, Sarah had knocked down 3 of the 6 cans. Not perfect, but good enough to make Jake think she might actually survive if things went bad. You're a natural, he told her. Sarah smiled, pleased despite the ringing in her ears. I had a good teacher. That evening after supper, as they sat on the porch watching stars emerge, Sarah asked him about his wife. What was she like, Rebecca? Jake smoked in silence for a long while before answering. Kind, patient, too good for me probably. We met in 72, married in 73. She died of typhoid in 75. 28 years old. Never got to have children. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. Does it bother you, Sarah asked carefully, that I'm here, in the bed you shared with her? Jake looked at her. Really looked. Rebecca made me promise right before she died, made me swear I wouldn't spend the rest of my life alone. Said she wanted me to be happy, even if she couldn't be there to see it. He paused. So no, it doesn't bother me. I think she'd be glad. Sarah reached over and took his hand. They sat like that until the moon rose, 2 people learning to be less alone. On the 7th day, something shifted between them. Sarah came to find him at noon while he was replacing a broken fence post. The work had him stripped to the waist, sweating in the heat. She closed the barn door behind her and leaned against it. Just looked at him for a long moment. This is the 2nd time today, she said. Jake set down the post hole digger. I know what time it is. I don't want you to think I'm only doing this because I promised. What do you mean? Sarah crossed to him, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes. I mean somewhere between day 3 and day 7, this stopped being about keeping a promise. I come to you because I want to. Because when I'm with you, I feel safe and wanted and like I matter. Do you understand? Jake's throat went tight. Sarah, I'm 23 years older than you. I don't care about that. You should. You deserve someone young, someone who can give you a full life. I don't want someone young, Sarah said fiercely. I want you, the man who saved me, the man who treats me like a person, not property, the man who makes me feel like I have value beyond what's between my legs. Before Jake could respond, she kissed him. Not tentative or uncertain, direct and sure. When she pulled back, Jake could barely breathe. I think I'm falling in love with you, he admitted. Good, Sarah whispered, because I already fell. That night, when she came to him for the 3rd time, everything felt different. Not an obligation or even a choice, just 2 people finding comfort and joy in each other. Afterward, lying tangled in the sheets with Sarah's head on his chest, Jake allowed himself to imagine a future. Marriage, children, growing old together on this ranch. He was so caught up in the fantasy that he almost missed the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. Miguel burst through the door without knocking. Patron! Riders coming! 2 of them watching the ranch from the East Ridge. Jake was on his feet in seconds, pulling on pants and grabbing his Winchester. Sarah wrapped herself in a sheet, eyes wide with sudden fear. Is it Cross? She asked. Don't know yet, Jake said, but I'm not taking chances. Miguel, bar the doors and windows. Sarah, get dressed and get the Colt. If anyone tries to come in, you shoot them, understood? She nodded, already moving. Jake stepped out onto the porch as the sun set behind him, casting long shadows across the yard. Two riders sat their horses on the ridge about 400 yards out, too far to identify clearly, but close enough to send a message. They sat there for 10 minutes just watching. Then one of them lifted something white and waved it, a handkerchief or a flag. Then they turned and rode away. Jake stood on the porch long after they'd vanished, Winchester in hand, jaw clenched tight. Cross knew where she was. The waiting was over. Tomorrow or the day after or next week, he would come. And when he did, blood would spill on this land. The only question was whose. On the 9th day, Miguel rode to Wilcox to check for mail and supplies. He returned 3 hours later with a letter bearing the official seal of the U.S. Marshal's office. Jake tore it open with shaking hands. Sarah stood beside him, reading over his shoulder. The letter was from Henry Garrett, written in the precise script of a man trained in military correspondence. Jake, received your telegram and detailed letter. I have investigated Nathaniel Cross for the past 9 days. The situation is worse than you indicated. Cross has killed 3 people, not 1. Robert Hayes in 80, Martha Collins in 81, and James O'Brien in 82. I have located 2 additional survivors who were abandoned in the desert by Cross's men. Both are willing to testify. I am also investigating the cattle poisoning you mentioned. Cross has purchased 11 ranches in the past 4 years, all after mysterious livestock die-offs. I will arrive in Wilcox on the 16th of July. I need Miss Mitchell's direct testimony for the formal charges. Warning: Cross has 12 armed men. He has also bribed the Wilcox sheriff. You cannot rely on local law enforcement. Stay at your ranch. Do not travel alone. Keep weapons close at all times. I will bring 3 deputies with me. We will arrest Cross with full force of federal law. But I need 4 more days. Can you hold out that long? Your friend, Henry Garrett, U.S. Marshal, Arizona Territory. Sarah's hands trembled as she finished reading. He sent that telegram the first day. You knew help was coming all along. Jake folded the letter carefully. I knew I'd ask for help. Didn't know if it would come in time. 4 more days, Miguel muttered. We need to survive 4 more days. That night, none of them slept well. They took turns on watch, 2 hours each, scanning the darkness for movement. Jake had a bad feeling, the kind that came from years of combat experience. The kind that said the enemy was close and getting closer. At 3 in the morning on the 10th day, Jake's instincts proved correct. He woke to the smell of smoke. The hay barn was on fire. By the time Jake and Miguel got outside with buckets, flames were climbing 20 feet high. The wind was blowing east, toward the horse barn, where Duchess and 5 other horses slept. Water chain, Jake shouted. Now! Sarah appeared with buckets. The 3 of them formed a line from the well to the fire, passing buckets hand to hand, dumping water on flames that seemed to laugh at their efforts. 45 minutes later, exhausted and filthy with soot, they'd managed to save the horse barn. But the hay barn was a total loss. 2 tons of feed, enough to last through winter, gone. As the sun rose, Jake walked the perimeter and found what he was looking for. A broken kerosene bottle at the base of the burned structure. Boot prints in the soft dirt. 2 horses shod heading east. Cross, Miguel said, studying the tracks. He's declaring war. Jake straightened up, Winchester in hand. Then war is what he'll get. That morning, after Sarah had gone back inside to wash the soot from her skin, Miguel pulled Jake aside. Patron, there is something you should know about me, the older man said quietly. Something I have never told you. Jake waited. I worked for Cross once, 3 years from 78 to 81. I was one of his men. The words hung in the air like a confession at church. Jake's grip tightened on his rifle, but he didn't point it. Not yet. Tell me, he said. And Miguel did. Told him about the cattle poisoning, the midnight raids, the intimidation. Told him about the night he'd witnessed Cross shoot Robert Hayes in the back and dump his body over a cliff. Told him about Martha Collins, the widow Cross had left to die in the desert 2 years ago. I ran, Miguel said, voice rough with shame. I saw what he did to Hayes, and I knew if I stayed, eventually he'd make me do the same. So I stole a horse in the night and rode until I found your ranch. You gave me work and never asked questions. For 5 years, I have tried to be a good man to make up for the bad years. Why tell me this now? Jake asked. Because if you protect Miss Sarah, you will have to fight Cross, and when that happens, I will fight beside you. I owe him a debt of blood for the things I saw and did not stop. And I owe you a debt of loyalty for the life you gave me when I was running scared. Miguel met Jake's eyes. I am ready to die for this, Patron. For you and for her. To make right what I helped make wrong. Jake looked at this man who'd worked beside him for 5 years. Loyal, hardworking, honest in every way that mattered. The past didn't erase that. Didn't change who Miguel had become. Then we stand together, Jake said, and offered his hand. Miguel shook it, and something like relief passed over his weathered features. That afternoon, while Jake was checking the horses, Sarah found him in the barn. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. There's something I need to tell you, she said, about Cross, about why I really offered you that deal. Jake guided her to a hay bale and sat beside her. Waited. He touched me, Sarah whispered, before the desert, at his party, when everyone was watching. He kissed me, forced his mouth on mine while 200 people stood there. I pushed him away, but later he followed me outside, grabbed me from behind, put his hands on me, and said terrible things. Her voice cracked. I've never told anyone this, but when I close my eyes, I can still feel his hands, still smell his breath. And I hate it. I hate that he marked me like that. She looked up at Jake with eyes full of tears and fury. That's why I offered you 3 times a day, not just to pay you back, but because I needed to replace those memories. I needed to let someone I trusted touch me, so I could remember what it felt like to be touched with kindness instead of violence. Does that make sense? Jake pulled her close, holding her while she cried. It makes perfect sense. And for what it's worth, you're one of the bravest people I've ever met. I don't feel brave. I feel broken. Broken things can heal, Jake said. They just need time and someone to help hold the pieces together until they do. Sarah cried for a long time. Jake just held her, one hand stroking her hair, and wished he could kill Nathaniel Cross with his bare hands. They had 4 more days until Marshal Garrett arrived. 4 more days to survive. But as Jake looked at Sarah, at this fierce woman who'd chosen death over submission, he made a silent vow. Whatever came next, however this ended, Cross would never touch her again, even if Jake had to die to make sure of it. The 11th day dawned hot and still, the kind of weather that made men irritable and horses skittish. Jake woke before sunrise, his body trained by decades of military discipline to recognize danger before his conscious mind caught up. Something felt wrong. The air tasted different, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with the coming heat. Sarah still slept beside him, her breathing deep and steady. For a moment, Jake just watched her, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the way her hair spread across the pillow. If things went bad in the next few days, he wanted to remember this, wanted to carry the image of her peaceful face with him into whatever came next. He slipped out of bed without waking her, dressed quickly, and stepped onto the porch. The ranch spread out before him in shades of purple and gray, the sun not yet high enough to burn away the shadows. Everything looked normal. The horse barn stood solid. The corral gate remained latched, no sign of intruders. But Jake's instincts, honed by years of combat, screamed at him that they were being watched. Miguel emerged from the bunkhouse, rifle already in hand. The older man's face told Jake he felt it too. They're out there, Miguel said quietly in Spanish. I can feel eyes on us. Jake nodded. Check the cattle. I'll check the water sources. Don't go more than a quarter mile from the house. They split up, moving with the careful awareness of men who knew they might be walking into an ambush. Jake saddled Duchess and rode out to the small pond where his 40 head of cattle drank. The animals stood clustered together, more agitated than usual. Several were already dead, lying on their sides near the water's edge. Jake dismounted and examined the nearest corpse. The cow's mouth was foaming, eyes rolled back, body already stiff with rigor mortis. He knelt beside the pond and smelled the water. Faint chemical odor, bitter almonds, arsenic. The same poison Cross had used on Daniel Mitchell's cattle 2 years ago. The same method, the same casual cruelty, destroying a man's livelihood and as easily as pouring powder into water. Jake pulled a small bottle from his saddlebag and collected a water sample. Evidence for Marshall Garrett, another crime to add to the growing list. As he stood, movement caught his eye. Two riders on the eastern ridge, maybe 400 yards distant. Too far for accurate rifle work, but close enough to send a message. They sat their horses in full view, making no effort to hide. Jake pulled his telescope from the saddlebag and trained it on them. Both wore dusters and broad-brimmed hats. Both carried rifles across their saddles. One raised a hand in mock salute. Then they wheeled their horses and disappeared over the ridge. The message was clear. We know where you are, we're watching, and there's nothing you can do about it. Jake rode back to the ranch with rage burning in his chest like swallowed fire. Sarah met him at the door, already dressed, coffee cup in hand. What happened? She asked, reading his face. Cross-poisoned the water source. Killed 4 head. Maybe more by now. Jake dismounted heavily. And he's got men watching us, 2 on the east ridge. Sarah's cup trembled in her hand. He's testing us, seeing how we react. More than that, Miguel said, emerging from the barn. He's trying to provoke you into leaving the ranch. If you go after his men, he can ambush you. If you stay here, he can pick away at you bit by bit. Psychological warfare. Jake had seen the tactic before during the Apache campaigns. Pin your enemy down, destroy his resources, wait for desperation to make him do something stupid. It was effective because it worked on the mind as much as the body. We don't take the bait, Jake said. We stay here, we stay together, and we wait for Garrett. 3 more days. We can last 3 more days. But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at him. 3 days was a long time when your enemy controlled the ground around you. That afternoon, as Jake was repairing fence posts near the house, Sarah brought him water. She'd been quieter than usual all morning, her eyes distant and worried. I've been thinking, she said, maybe I should just go to him, end this before anyone else gets hurt. Jake set down the post-hole digger and turned to face her. No. But Jake, he's destroying your ranch. He killed your cattle. He's going to keep hurting you until I give in. Maybe if I just... No, Jake repeated more firmly. You listen to me, Sarah Mitchell. What Cross is doing isn't about you anymore. It's about power. About proving that he can take whatever he wants, whenever he wants it. If you go to him now, you think he'll just forgive and forget? You think he won't punish you for embarrassing him? Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I don't want you to die because of me. Jake cupped her face in his work-roughened hands. I'm not dying, and neither are you. We're going to survive this together, and then we're going to watch Cross hang for his crimes. That's how this ends. Not with you sacrificing yourself to a monster. She leaned into him, and he held her there in the afternoon heat, both of them pretending they believed his confident words. The attack came at 3 in the morning on the 12th day. Jake was on watch, sitting in the rocking chair on the porch with the Winchester across his lap. Miguel had the midnight to 2 shift, Jake had 2 to 4, then Miguel would take over again until dawn. It was exhausting running on 4 hours of broken sleep, but they had no choice. The first warning was the sound of breaking glass. A rock the size of a man's fist came through the parlor window, trailing a piece of paper tied with string. It hit the floor with a heavy thud that brought Jake to his feet, rifle raised. Sarah appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a sheet, eyes wide with fear. What was that? Stay back, Jake ordered. He picked up the rock carefully, untied the paper, and read the message scrawled in rough pencil. 24 hours. He'd barely processed the words when the shooting started. 5 riders emerged from the darkness, circling the house at a distance of about 150 yards. They fired revolvers into the air, whooping and hollering like it was all a game. The noise was designed to terrify, to rob sleep, to make the people inside feel hunted. Jake didn't waste ammunition shooting back at moving targets in the dark. Instead, he took careful aim at the horse of the nearest rider and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester barked once, and the horse screamed and went down, throwing its rider hard into the dirt. The man's legs snapped with an audible crack. His screams joined the chaos. Fire into the house, someone shouted. Jake recognized the voice even before he saw the speaker. Nathaniel Cross himself sitting a big black stallion just outside the light from the windows. Suddenly the night exploded with gunfire. Bullets slammed into the wooden walls of the house, tearing through the pine logs like paper. Jake threw himself flat as lead whined overhead. Glass shattered, wood splintered, the air filled with the smell of gunpowder and dust. "Sarah!" Jake shouted. "Get down! Get to the root cellar!" But Sarah had her own ideas about survival. She appeared at the back window with Jake's Colt 45, aimed with both hands the way he taught her, and fired 3 quick shots. One of the riders jerked and fell from his saddle, clutching his shoulder. Miguel burst from the bunkhouse with his 12-gauge shotgun, firing both barrels toward the attackers. The buckshot caught one man in the chest at 40 yards, lifting him clear off his horse. For 5 minutes, the ranch became a war zone. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness. Horses screamed, men shouted. The smell of blood and burnt powder filled the air. Then, as suddenly as it started, the shooting stopped. The remaining riders wheeled their horses and galloped into the darkness, leaving 2 wounded men behind. One with a broken leg, one with buckshot in his chest. The latter wouldn't see sunrise. Cross's voice echoed across the distance. "We'll be back, Thornton. You can't keep her forever." Jake stood slowly, ears ringing, heart pounding. He did a quick count of bullet holes in the walls. 17. Any one of them could have killed Sarah or Miguel. They'd been lucky, incredibly lucky. Sarah emerged from the back room still holding the Colt. Her hands were rock steady, but her face was pale as milk. "Did I kill him? The man I shot?" "You hit him in the shoulder," Jake said. "He'll live." "I don't know if I'm relieved or disappointed." She set the gun down carefully. "Is this what war feels like? This constant fear?" "This is exactly what war feels like," Jake confirmed. "The waiting is worse than the fighting. At least during a fight, you know what's happening." Miguel dragged the man with buckshot in his chest inside, not out of mercy but to question him. But the man was already fading, blood pooling beneath him. He died before he could say a word. The man with the broken leg they left where he'd fallen. Come morning, his friends could retrieve him. Or not. Jake found he didn't much care either way. As dawn broke over the ranch, revealing the full extent of the damage, Jake surveyed their situation with a military eye. The house looked like it had been through a battle, which it had. 2 windows were shot out. The walls were pockmarked with bullet holes. The front door hung crooked on its hinges. But they'd survived, all 3 of them, without a scratch. 2 more days, Jake said to no one in particular. Just 2 more days. On the 13th day, exhaustion became their biggest enemy. Jake hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in 4 days. His hands shook when he poured coffee. His eyes burned. His reflexes, normally sharp, had slowed to the point where he worried about his ability to fight if Cross came again. Sarah was in better shape, but not by much. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. She jumped at every sound, every creak of the house settling. Only Miguel seemed unaffected, running on some reserve of endurance that Jake envied. The older man moved through the day like a machine, checking perimeters, cleaning weapons, preparing for the next assault. They didn't leave the house except to tend the horses. They ate cold food to avoid smoke from cooking fires. They spoke in whispers, as if Cross's men might hear them from miles away. The isolation and fear were weapons as effective as bullets. Around noon, as Sarah was trying to get Jake to eat some jerky and hardtack, they heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. Jake grabbed his Winchester and moved to the window. A single rider coming from the direction of Wilcox. Too far to identify, but riding with purpose. "Miguel," Jake called. "Second window. If this goes bad, we fire together." But as the rider got closer, Jake recognized the horse. Brown mare with a white blaze. That was Harrison's mount, the telegraph operator from Wilcox. The man reined up outside the fence line, staying well back, hands raised to show he was unarmed. "Mr. Thornton," he called, "I have a message from Marshal Garrett. Important message." Jake stepped onto the porch, rifle held across his chest. "Read it from there." Harrison pulled a telegram from his pocket and shouted the words, "Train delayed stop, will arrive evening of 16th. Not morning stop, hold position, stop, help coming, stop, Garrett." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Not morning, evening. That was an extra 12 hours. 12 hours that felt like a lifetime when men were trying to kill you. You got that? Harrison called. I got it, Jake shouted back. You tell anyone else about this telegram? No, sir. Came straight here. Good. Now get out of here before Cross's men see you and think you're helping us. Harrison needed no further encouragement. He wheeled his horse and galloped back toward town. Jake stood on the porch long after the man disappeared, feeling the weight of those extra 12 hours settle on his shoulders. Behind him, he heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath. She'd been listening. Evening, she said quietly. That means we have to survive all of tomorrow, too. We'll make it, Jake said, but even he didn't believe it. That afternoon, Sarah found him sitting on the porch, head in his hands. She sat beside him without speaking, just her presence offering comfort. I'm sorry, she finally said. For what? For bringing this to your door. Your ranch is destroyed. Your cattle are dead. You're fighting a war because you were kind enough to save me. Jake turned to look at her. Sarah, listen to me carefully. I've lived on this land for 15 years. Built this house with my own hands. Lost my wife here. I thought I'd die here alone, another old man the desert forgot. But then you showed up and reminded me what it feels like to have something worth protecting, worth fighting for. So don't you dare apologize. You gave me back my life. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I love you, Jake Thornton. I know I'm supposed to wait for you to say it first, but I don't care about those rules. I love you. And if we die tomorrow, I want you to know that. Jake kissed her then, deep and long, tasting salt from her tears. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. I love you too, and we're not dying tomorrow. We're going to survive this, get married, and grow old together, annoying our grandchildren. That's a promise. Sarah laughed, the sound watery but genuine. You better keep that promise, old man. I always keep my promises, Jake said. That night they didn't make love. They were too exhausted, too worried about the coming day. Instead, they just held each other, drawing strength from simple proximity. Sarah fell asleep in Jake's arms, and he stayed awake, listening to her breathe, memorizing the weight and warmth of her. Miguel kept watch outside, a shadow moving through deeper shadows. On the 14th day, Nathaniel Cross showed his hand. Dawn came gray and threatening, clouds building over the mountains to the west. Rain would be a blessing after weeks of drought, but it would also provide cover for attackers. Reduced visibility worked both ways. Jake was checking the horses when Miguel came running from the south fence line, moving faster than Jake had seen him move in years. Patron! The cattle! All of them! Jake followed Miguel to the southern pasture and felt his stomach drop. The remaining 36 head of cattle lay dead, scattered across the grass like discarded toys. Throats cut, systematic slaughter. It must have happened during the night, while they were all inside or watching the house. Cross's men had moved through the darkness like ghosts, killing Jake's livelihood without making a sound. This is psychological warfare, Miguel said. He's showing you that he can take everything, that walls and guns won't stop him. Jake's hands clenched into fists. The cattle represented years of work, thousands of dollars, his entire income for the coming year. Cross had just destroyed him financially with the stroke of a knife. Except Jake didn't care about the money anymore. Didn't care about the cattle. All he cared about was keeping Sarah alive for one more day. Let's get back to the house, he said quietly. This is meant to draw us out. I'm not taking the bait. But when they returned, they found Sarah standing on the porch with a piece of paper in her hand. Her face had gone white as bone. It was tied to the door, she said, voice hollow, nailed there like Martin Luther's theses. Jake took the paper and read, Thornton, by now you've seen what I did to your cattle. Tonight, if Sarah doesn't walk out of that house by midnight, I'll burn it to the ground with all of you inside. The choice is yours. You can keep your pride and die. Or you can give me what's mine and live. You have 12 hours. End Cross. Jake crumpled the paper in his fist. He's bluffing. Is he? Sarah asked. Jake, he killed 36 cattle just to make a point. You think he won't burn the house? If he burns us out, we'll fight in the open. He knows that. He's trying to scare us into doing something stupid. Maybe the stupid thing is staying here, Sarah said. Her voice had taken on a desperate edge. Maybe we should run. Take the horses and ride for Bisbee or Tucson. Get out of Cross's territory. And leave everything? Jake shook his head. This is my land, my home. I'm not running. Then you're going to die for dirt, Sarah shouted, and it was the first time she'd raised her voice at him. Is that worth it? Is your pride worth more than your life? It's not about pride, Jake said, trying to keep his own voice level. It's about what happens if we run. Cross will hunt us. He has the men, the money, the connections. We'd be looking over our shoulders for the rest of our lives. The only way this ends is if we stand our ground until Garrett arrives. One more day, Sarah, that's all we need. Sarah's shoulders slumped. And if we don't make it, then we don't, but at least we'll die free. The words sounded braver than Jake felt. Truth was, he was terrified. Not for himself, he'd made peace with death a long time ago, but for Sarah. For this fierce, brilliant woman who deserved a lifetime of happiness, not a shallow grave in the Arizona desert. As noon approached and the temperature climbed, the three of them prepared for what they knew was coming. Jake had fought enough battles to recognize the signs. Cross was done playing games. Tonight would be the final assault. They moved ammunition into the house, filled every container they could find with water in case of fire, soaked blankets and hung them over the windows to slow flames, turned the house into a fortress. Miguel pulled Jake aside while Sarah was in the back room. Patron, I have been thinking. If it comes to fighting tonight, I should make a run for Wilcox, bring the law. The sheriff is bought by Cross, you know that. Then I will bring citizens, armed men who are tired of Cross's tyranny. There are good people in that town, Jake, people who would stand with us if they knew what was happening. Jake considered it. The ranch was 12 miles from town. If Miguel left at dusk, rode hard, he could be there in 90 minutes, could potentially return with help before midnight, or he could be shot off his horse before he made it a mile. It's too dangerous, Jake said finally. Everything is dangerous now, Miguel replied, but doing nothing is most dangerous of all. Let me go, Patron. Let me do this one thing that might save us. Before Jake could answer, Sarah screamed from inside the house. Both men ran. They found her standing at the back window, pointing with a shaking hand. 4 of their 6 horses lay dead in the corral. Duchess and Duke, the only survivors, stood trembling in the corner. When? Jake demanded. When did this happen? Just now, Sarah said. I was watching. Men came over the back fence, cut the horses' throats. I fired at them, but missed. The tactical situation had just gotten infinitely worse. Without horses, they couldn't run even if they wanted to, couldn't send for help, couldn't do anything but wait for Cross to make his move. And Cross knew it. This was his checkmate. He'd boxed them in and was now closing the trap. Tonight, Miguel said quietly. He'll come tonight. Jake nodded. We make our stand, all 3 of us, together. They spent the rest of the afternoon in tense silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Jake cleaned and loaded every weapon in the house. 21 rounds for the Winchester, 8 rounds for the Colt, 6 shells for the shotgun. Miguel's rifle held another 15 rounds. Not much ammunition for a prolonged fight, but it would have to do. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of blood red and gold, Sarah came to Jake. She changed into pants and a shirt of his, practical clothing for fighting. Her hair was pulled back tight. The Colt was belted around her waist. She looked like a soldier preparing for battle. Whatever happens tonight, she said, I want you to know something. These past 2 weeks with you have been the happiest of my life. You gave me back my freedom, my dignity, my sense of self. If I die tonight, I die knowing what it feels like to be truly loved. That's more than most people get. Jake pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, trying to memorize every detail. You're not going to die. I won't let you. You can't promise that. Watch me. They stood together as darkness fell over the ranch, 2 people facing impossible odds, refusing to surrender. Cross came at 10 o'clock, 2 hours before his deadline. Jake saw them first, a line of riders silhouetted against the moonlit horizon. He counted 10 men on horseback, moving slowly, deliberately, knowing they had won before the fight even started. Nathaniel Cross rode at the center on his big black stallion. Even from a distance, Jake could see the man's confidence, the casual arrogance of someone who'd never been told no and meant it. They stopped 100 yards from the house, just outside accurate rifle range. Cross dismounted and took a few steps forward, hands clasped behind his back like a general surveying a battlefield. "Thornton," he called, his voice carrying easily in the still night air. "Let's talk like reasonable men. No need for more bloodshed." Jake stepped onto the porch, Winchester held ready but not aimed. "I've got nothing to say to you, Cross." "I think you do," Cross replied. "You fought bravely, I'll give you that. Protected the lady like a knight from the old stories. But we both know how this ends. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time. So let's make a deal. I don't deal with men who poison cattle and murder women. Careful with your accusations, Thornton. Those are serious charges." Cross's voice carried amusement now. "But I'm a generous man. Here's my final offer. Send Sarah out right now and I'll let you and your Mexican live. You have my word as a gentleman." From inside the house, Sarah's voice rang out clear and defiant. "I'd rather burn." Cross's expression darkened, visible even at this distance. "That can be arranged. You think these walls will protect you? I'll burn you out like rats in a barn. Last chance, Thornton. Be smart." Jake raised the Winchester and aimed it directly at Cross's chest. "Here's my answer. Come and try." For a heartbeat, everything froze. Then Cross smiled, a predator's expression, and raised one hand. 4 of his men dismounted and pulled bottles from their saddlebags. Jake recognized them immediately. Kerosene bombs, cloths stuffed in the necks ready to light and throw. "Burn them out," Cross ordered. The men lit their bottles from torches and threw. 2 bottles arced through the air and crashed against the front of the house. 2 more hit the sides. Kerosene splashed across wooden cloth, and flames erupted with a hungry roar. In seconds, the house was burning. "Out the back!" Jake shouted. "Move! Now!" They burst through the back door into a hail of gunfire. Cross had positioned 3 men there, waiting for exactly this. Miguel fired his shotgun twice, dropping 1 man, but bullets whined past Jake's head close enough to feel the wind of their passage. Sarah fired the Colt, 3 quick shots that drove the attackers to cover. It was just enough time for all 3 of them to reach the water trough 30 feet from the house. They dove behind it as gunfire intensified. Bullets slammed into the wooden trough, punching through and sending water spraying. The trough wouldn't provide cover for long. Behind them, the house was fully engulfed now, flames reaching into the night sky. 10 years of Jake's life, burning. Rebecca's memory, burning. Everything he'd built, turning to ash. But Jake didn't look back. He focused forward, on survival, on protecting the woman beside him. "Horse barn," he shouted. "We can ford up there. Move when I say." He raised the Winchester and fired 3 quick shots toward the attackers, buying seconds. Miguel grabbed Sarah and ran, half dragging her toward the barn 60 yards away. Jake laid down covering fire, walking backward, shooting at muzzle flashes. One of Cross's men made the mistake of standing up to get a better shot. Jake's bullet caught him center mass, spinning him around. The man fell and didn't get up. "Patron!" Miguel's voice from the barn. "We're in!" Jake turned and sprinted, legs pumping, lungs burning. Bullets kicked up dust at his feet. Something tugged at his shirt, a bullet passing so close it tore the fabric but missed flesh. He dove through the barn door, and Miguel slammed it shut behind him. They shoved a feed bin against it for extra weight, then took up positions at the windows. Jake did a quick inventory. 21 rounds in the Winchester, now down to 15. 8 rounds in the Colt. Miguel had maybe 10 rounds left for his rifle. Sarah's Colt was down to 3 rounds. Not enough. Not nearly enough for what was coming. "They'll rush us," Miguel said calmly, stating fact without emotion. "They know we're low on ammunition. They'll wait a few minutes to let us worry, then they'll come all at once." Sarah reloaded the Colt with shaking hands. "How many did we get?" 2 dead for sure, Jake said. "Maybe 1 wounded. That leaves 7 or 8 healthy fighters plus Cross." "Not good odds." "No," Jake agreed. "Not good at all." They waited in tense silence, listening to Cross's men move around outside. Heard them talking, planning. Heard Cross giving orders in that confident voice. Then, inevitably, they heard something that made Jake's blood run cold. Hoofbeats, but not departing. Circling. Getting closer. "They're going to rush us," Miguel confirmed. "All of them at once." Jake positioned himself at the front window, Miguel at the side, Sarah covering the back. This was it. The last stand. Win or die. "Sarah," Jake said quietly, "if this goes bad, if they get in here, you take Duke and ride. Don't stop, don't look back. Just ride east until you find help." "I'm not leaving you, Babs," Sarah said flatly. "You have to. That's an order." "I don't take orders from you, Jake Thornton. We survive together or we die together. Those are the only options." Jake wanted to argue, but there was no time. The hoofbeats were thundering now, coming fast. He raised the Winchester, sighted down the barrel, and waited. The first rider burst around the corner of the burning house, riding hard, rifle raised. Jake led him by a fraction and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester bucked, the man jerked, and both horse and rider went down in a tangle of thrashing limbs. Two more riders came from the left. Miguel's rifle cracked twice. One rider clutched his shoulder and wheeled away. The other kept coming, firing wildly. Sarah shot through the back window, her bullet catching another attacker in the leg. The man screamed and fell from his horse. For 3 minutes, the barn became the center of hell. Gunfire from all sides, bullets punching through wood. The smell of gun smoke and blood thick in the air. Jake fired until his Winchester clicked empty. Dropped it, pulled his Colt, kept shooting. Beside him, Miguel did the same. They were going to die here. Jake knew it. But they'd die fighting, and they'd take as many of Cross's men with them as possible. Just as Jake's Colt clicked on an empty chamber, just as he reached for Miguel's Bowie knife to make his last stand with cold steel, a new sound cut through the chaos. A bugle. The cavalry charge, sharp and clear and impossible. Then gunfire from a new direction. Disciplined, controlled, military precise. Jake risked a look out the window and saw something he'd thought he'd never see. Marshal Henry Garrett and 3 deputies, riding hard, rifles blazing. "Federal officers," Garrett's voice boomed across the battlefield. "Lay down your weapons. You're all under arrest." Cross's remaining men broke immediately. Some threw down their guns and raised their hands. Others tried to run and were shot from their saddles by Garrett's deputies. Cross himself stood frozen, face gone white, as he realized his carefully planned attack had just turned into his own capture. Garrett reined his horse up beside Cross and aimed a rifle at the man's chest. "Nathaniel Cross, you're under arrest for murder, attempted murder, and about 6 other charges. You so much as breathe wrong, I'll blow you in half." Cross opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. Jake stumbled out of the barn on shaking legs. Sarah was right behind him, followed by Miguel. They stood there, covered in soot, in blood, and gunpowder residue, watching as Garrett's deputies rounded up Cross's men. Garrett dismounted and walked over to Jake. The 2 men stared at each other for a long moment. Then Garrett broke into a smile. "You look like hell, Lieutenant," Garrett said. "You're 12 hours early, Marshal," Jake replied. "Not that I'm complaining. Train got in early, something about new locomotives. I figured you could use the help sooner rather than later." Garrett looked at the burning house, the dead horses, the bodies. "Looks like I was right." Jake turned to Sarah, who stood there with tears streaming down her face. Not tears of sadness, tears of relief so profound it bordered on disbelief. "It's over," she whispered. "It's really over." Jake pulled her into his arms and held her while she cried. Behind them, the house collapsed in on itself with a roar of flame and falling timber. Everything Jake owned, gone. But he'd kept his promise. He'd protected her, and sometimes that was all that mattered. Marshal Garrett supervised the arrest of Nathaniel Cross personally, making sure to read out every single charge as he locked the shackles around the man's wrists. Cross said nothing, just stared at Sarah with eyes full of rage and humiliation. "You'll regret this," he finally said. "You don't know who you're dealing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Garrett replied. "A coward who tried to murder a woman because she wouldn't marry him. The judge is going to love that story." As deputies led Cross away, the man looked back at Sarah one last time. "She's mine," he shouted. "Mine by right. Her father owed me." People aren't property, Garrett said flatly. You're about to learn that lesson the hard way. When the prisoners were secure and the deputies had begun the grim work of dealing with the bodies, Garrett pulled Jake and Sarah aside. I need you both in Tucson for the trial, he said. We've got a strong case, but your testimony will seal it. Can you be there in 6 weeks? We'll be there, Jake promised. Garrett nodded, then looked at the ruins of the house. Where will you stay until then? I'll rebuild, Jake said. It's what I do. We'll rebuild, Sarah corrected, taking his hand. Garrett smiled. I'll leave 2 deputies here for the next week, just in case Cross has any friends who might cause trouble. After that, you should be safe. As dawn broke over to the ranch, painting the ruins in shades of gray and gold, Jake stood with his arm around Sarah and surveyed what was left. The house was gone. The barn was riddled with bullet holes. The cattle were dead. By any measure, he'd lost everything, except he hadn't. He still had Sarah, still had Miguel, who'd fought beside him like a brother, still had land and hands to work it and time to rebuild. What do you want to do first? Sarah asked. Jake looked down at her, this woman who'd come into his life tied to a cross and left him freer than he'd been in 10 years. First, he said, I want to bury Miguel. Sarah's face fell. Miguel? But he's right there. He's fine. Jake shook his head slowly. During the fight, in the chaos and smoke, he'd seen Miguel take a bullet, seen the older man clutch his chest and go down. Jake had been too busy fighting to check, too desperate to survive. Now, as the adrenaline faded, he looked toward where Miguel had been standing. The older man sat with his back against the barn wall, hand pressed to his chest, blood seeping between his fingers. His face was pale but peaceful. Jake ran to him, Sarah right behind. Miguel looked up at them and smiled. Did we win, Patron? He asked, voice already getting weaker. We won, Jake said, tears streaming down his face. We won, hermano. Good, Miguel breathed. That is good. Tell Miss Sarah. Tell her I died a good man. That matters, that I was a good man at the end. You were always a good man, Sarah said, kneeling beside him. Always. Miguel's eyes were drifting closed now. The tree, he whispered. Bury me under the oak tree. With Rebecca. With the good people. I promise, Jake said. But Miguel was already gone. They sat there with him as the sun rose, 2 survivors holding vigil for the man who'd given everything so they could have a future. They buried Miguel Rodriguez under the white oak tree at noon on the 16th of July, 1883. The same tree that sheltered Rebecca's grave, its gnarled roots deep in Arizona soil, its branches offering shade in a land that showed no mercy to the living or the dead. Jake carved the headstone himself from a thick piece of walnut wood, working through the night by lamplight while Sarah slept fitfully in the barn. His hands, still shaking from exhaustion and battle, guided the chisel with painstaking care. Every letter mattered. Every word was a promise kept. Miguel Rodriguez, 1845 to 1883. Loyal friend, brave warrior, good man. Marshal Garrett stood beside them as Jake and Sarah lowered Miguel's body into the earth. The 2 deputies Garrett had left behind removed their hats and bowed their heads. Even in death, Miguel commanded respect. Jake read from Psalms, the 23rd, the same words he'd spoken over Rebecca's grave 10 years ago. His voice cracked on the familiar phrases. The valley of the shadow of death. No fear of evil. Goodness and mercy. Sarah placed wildflowers on the fresh dirt. Arizona poppies, bright orange against the dark soil. Miguel had loved color in this brown landscape, had planted flowers around the bunkhouse every spring, tending them with the same care he gave to horses. He saved my life, Sarah said quietly, threw himself at that man so I could escape. I'll never forget that. He died for honor, Jake replied. Died trying to make right what he thought he'd done wrong. That's all any man can ask for. To die better than he lived. They stood there until the sun climbed high and merciless, then walked back to the barn where they'd been sleeping since the house burned. Everything Jake owned fit in 2 saddlebags now. Clothes, a few tools, Rebecca's Bible, the deed to his land. A lifetime reduced to things you could carry on horseback. But he had Sarah, and strange as it seemed, that made him richer than he'd been when he had a house full of possessions and a heart full of loneliness. That afternoon, while Sarah rested in the shade, Jake walked the perimeter of his property with Garrett. The marshal had been putting off this conversation, Jake could tell, waiting for the right moment. Now, with Miguel in the ground and Sarah safe, the time had come. How bad did Cross hurt you financially? Garrett asked. Jake surveyed the burned house, the dead cattle, the poisoned water. Lost about $2,000 in livestock and buildings, another $500 in equipment. The land is still worth something, maybe $3,000 if I sold, but I'm not selling. Didn't figure you would. Garrett pulled out his tobacco pouch and rolled a cigarette with practiced efficiency. You know Cross is going to claim you attacked him. That all this was self-defense on his part. Can he make that stick? With the right lawyer and a sympathetic judge? Maybe. Garrett lit his cigarette and exhaled slowly. But we've got something he doesn't. We've got Miguel's dying declaration. We've got Sarah's testimony. We've got 2 of his men we captured who are willing to talk in exchange for reduced sentences. And we've got 4 dead bodies with Cross's bullets in them. You think he'll hang? I think he'll spend the rest of his life in Yuma Territorial Prison, which might be worse than hanging. Garrett looked at Jake seriously. But here's what I need you to understand. The trial is going to be rough. Cross's lawyers will tear into Sarah. They'll try to make her look like a loose woman who seduced you, then cried assault when things went bad. They'll bring up your age difference. They'll ask about that 3 times a day, promise she made. Jake's jaw tightened. They better watch their mouths. They won't. That's their job. To make the jury doubt Sarah's story, to make Cross look like the victim of a scheming woman. Garrett put a hand on Jake's shoulder. I'm telling you this now so you can prepare her. Testifying is going to be the hardest thing she's ever done. Harder than being left to die in the desert? In some ways, yes, because this time she'll have to relive it in front of strangers who'll judge her for surviving. Jake spent that evening preparing Sarah for what was coming. They sat on a log near Miguel's grave, watching the sun set over the mountains, while Jake explained how trials worked, how lawyers would twist her words, how the judge might allow questions that felt like assault all over again. They're going to ask about us, Jake said carefully, about what happened after I brought you here, about your promise. Sarah's face hardened. Let them ask. I'm not ashamed. I know you're not, but they'll try to make it sound sordid, like you prostituted yourself. I didn't prostitute myself, Sarah said fiercely. I made a choice, the first real choice I'd made in years, and I'd make it again. I just want you to know what's coming, so you're ready. Sarah turned to face him fully. Jake, I've been tied to a cross under the desert sun. I've been shot at. I've killed a man to protect myself. Do you really think a lawyer's questions are going to break me? Jake smiled despite himself. No, I don't suppose they will. Good, because I'm going to look that judge in the eye and tell him exactly what Nathaniel Cross did to me, to my father, to those other women. And when I'm home, there won't be a doubt in anyone's mind about who the monster is. They made love that night on a blanket under the stars, the burned ruins of the house a shadow against the moon. It wasn't about the promise anymore, hadn't been for a long time. It was about 2 people finding comfort and connection in the aftermath of violence. Afterward, lying in Jake's arms, Sarah said something that had been building for days. Marry me. Jake went still. What? You heard me. Marry me, before we go to Tucson, before the trial. I want to stand up in that courtroom as your wife, not your mistress or your victim or whatever other thing they try to call me. I want to be Sarah Thornton when I testify against Nathaniel Cross. Sarah, you don't have to. I know I don't have to, she interrupted. I want to, unless you don't want to marry me. Of course I want to marry you, but I have nothing to offer. No house, no money, nothing but debt and a burned-out ranch. Sarah propped herself up on one elbow and looked down at him. You're offering me freedom, choice, love. That's worth more than any house. So I'll ask again. Jake Thornton, will you marry me? Jake pulled her down and kissed her deeply. Yes. God, yes. They were married 3 days later in the small church in Wilcox. Reverend Chesley performed the ceremony, a kindly old man who'd known Rebecca and approved of Jake finding happiness again. Marshal Garrett stood as witness, along with the 2 deputies and a handful of townspeople who'd heard what Cross had done and wanted to show their support. Sarah wore a simple cotton dress, white as she could manage given the circumstances. Someone had donated it, a widow woman whose own daughter had died years before. It fit Sarah almost perfectly, needed only minor alteration at the waist. Jake wore the only suit he owned, the one he'd worn to Rebecca's funeral. He'd brushed the dust from it and hoped Rebecca would forgive him for wearing it to his second wedding. The ceremony was brief. Reverend Wesley read from Corinthians about love being patient and kind, asked them to make their vows. Jake's voice shook when he promised to love and protect Sarah until death. Sarah's didn't waver at all. When Reverend Wesley pronounced them husband and wife, the small congregation applauded. It felt like defiance, this public celebration. Cross had tried to force Sarah into marriage and failed. Now she was married on her own terms, to a man she'd chosen freely. That night in the barn that served as their temporary home, they consummated their marriage as free people. No promises hanging over them, no obligations except the ones they chose. Just a man and a woman who'd survived hell together and decided to build heaven out of the ashes. "Mrs. Thornton," Jake whispered against her hair. "Mr. Thornton," Sarah replied, and laughed with pure joy. The next morning, Jake's father-in-law arrived. Daniel Mitchell rode up to the ranch on a borrowed mule, looking 10 years older than when Jake had last seen him. The man had lost weight, his face gaunt and lined with worry, but his eyes were clear, and when he dismounted, he stood straight. Sarah ran to him. "Papa!" They embraced for a long time, both crying. When they finally separated, Daniel turned to Jake and extended his hand. "Mr. Thornton, I owe you my daughter's life. I can never repay that debt." Jake shook his hand firmly. "You don't owe me anything, but I'm glad you're here." Daniel looked at the burned house, the graves under the oak tree, the bullet-scarred barn. "Cross did all this?" "Cross did all this," Jake confirmed. "Then I'll testify against him. I'll tell the court everything. How he poisoned my cattle, how he forged those loan documents, how he threatened to kill me if Sarah didn't marry him." Daniel's voice grew stronger with each word. "I've been a coward, Mr. Thornton. Let my fear put my daughter in danger, but I'm done being afraid. Cross is going to pay for what he did." Over the next few weeks, as they waited for the trial date, the three of them worked to rebuild. Jake couldn't afford to reconstruct the house yet, but they could clear the rubble, salvage what was salvageable, make plans for the future. Sarah proved surprisingly capable with tools. She'd watched her father work for years, absorb more than either of them realized. She could hammer nails straight, cut boards to measure, mix mortar for the foundation they'd eventually need. Daniel stayed in the barn with them, sleeping on a cot in the corner. At first it was awkward, a father living with his newly married daughter and son-in-law. But the work smoothed over the discomfort. Shared labor had a way of making family out of strangers. One evening, as they sat around a small fire eating beans and cornbread, Daniel told them the full story of how Cross had entrapped him. "It started 2 years ago," Daniel said. "My cattle started dying. Just a few at first, then more and more. The vet couldn't figure it out, said it might be some new disease. I was losing 20, 30 head a month. By the end, I'd lost almost my whole herd." "That's when Cross appeared," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. "That's when Cross appeared," Daniel confirmed. "Offered to buy my land for half what it was worth. Said he was doing me a favor, taking it off my hands before I lost everything. I said no. Told him I'd rebuild." "So he offered you the loan," Jake said. "So he offered me the loan. $2,500 at 10% interest. Seemed fair at the time. I signed without reading carefully." Daniel's face twisted with shame. "That's the mistake that almost killed my daughter. Those papers said 40%, compounded monthly. By the time I realized, I owed over $5,000. "Did you keep the original loan documents?" Jake asked. "I did. They're in a lockbox at the bank. Why?" "Because those documents prove fraud. Garrett needs to see them." The next day, they rode into Wilcox together, the three of them on Duchess and Duke, and Daniel's borrowed mule. Marshal Garrett was staying at the hotel, coordinating with his deputies and preparing the case against Cross. When Daniel showed him the loan documents, Garrett's face broke into a satisfied smile. "This is beautiful," he said. "See here? The interest rate was written in different ink. Someone changed it after Daniel signed. Probably Cross himself, thinking a simple rancher wouldn't notice." "Can you prove it in court?" Sarah asked. "I can try. We'll need a handwriting expert, maybe a chemist to analyze the inks. But yes, this helps tremendously." Garrett looked at Daniel with new respect. You keeping these documents might have just sealed Cross's fate. The trial was set for the first week of September, 6 weeks after the attack on Jake's ranch. That gave them time to prepare, to gather evidence, to line up witnesses, but it also gave them time to worry. Cross had hired the most expensive lawyers in the territory. Men from San Francisco and Denver, sharp-suited predators who specialized in getting guilty men acquitted. They filed motion after motion, trying to get charges dismissed, trying to suppress evidence, trying to delay the trial indefinitely. But Judge William Barnes was having none of it. A stern man in his 60s, Barnes had a reputation for integrity that even Cross's money couldn't touch. He denied every spurious motion, kept the trial date firm, and made it clear that justice would be served in his courtroom. As summer turned to fall and the trial date approached, Jake and Sarah made the journey to Tucson. 80 miles by horse, 3 days of travel. Daniel came with them, and Marshal Garrett, and the 2 deputies who'd witnessed the final battle. They arrived in Tucson on a Wednesday evening, the city glowing gold in the setting sun. After weeks in the empty desert, the noise and crowds felt overwhelming. Sarah clung to Jake's arm, eyes wide, taking in the bustling streets and tall buildings. Garrett had arranged rooms for them at a modest hotel near the courthouse. Trial starts Monday, he told them. That gives you 4 days to rest and prepare. My advice, don't talk to anyone about the case. Cross's lawyers will have people watching, trying to trip you up. That night, lying in a real bed for the first time since the house burned, Sarah turned to Jake in the darkness. I'm scared, she admitted, of the trial, of failing, of not being believed, of Cross going free because I can't convince 12 men that I'm telling the truth. Jake pulled her close. Sarah, you're the strongest person I know. You're going to walk into that courtroom and tell your story, and those 12 men are going to believe every word, because the truth has power, and you're wielding it like a weapon. What if they ask about us, about the 3 times a day thing? Then you tell them the truth. That you made a choice to survive. That's nothing to be ashamed of. Sarah was quiet for a long time. Then, do you ever regret it, taking me in, fighting Cross, losing everything? Not for a second, Jake said with odd hesitation. You know what I had before you? A house full of ghosts and a future that looked exactly like my past. You gave me a reason to wake up every morning, gave me something worth fighting for. I'd burn down 100 houses for that. I love you, Jake Thornton. I love you too, Sarah Thornton. They made love quietly, mindful of the thin hotel walls, then fell asleep tangled together. Tomorrow would bring worry enough. Tonight they had each other. The trial of Nathaniel Cross began on Monday, September 3rd, 1883, in the federal courthouse of Arizona Territory. The courtroom was packed with spectators, newspapermen, curiosity seekers. Everyone wanted to see the powerful rancher brought low. Cross sat at the defense table in an expensive suit, flanked by his 3 lawyers. He looked calm, almost bored, as if this was merely an inconvenience to be endured. His eyes found Sarah in the gallery and held her gaze with naked contempt. Sarah didn't look away, didn't flinch, just stared back with the same cold determination she'd shown when she chose death over submission. Judge Barnes entered and the bailiff called the court to order. The judge was exactly as Jake had imagined. Stern-faced, gray-haired, with eyes that missed nothing. We are here, Barnes announced, to determine the guilt or innocence of Nathaniel Cross on 7 counts of serious crime. This court will be run with decorum and respect. Anyone who disrupts these proceedings will be removed. Are we clear? Everyone nodded. Then let us proceed. Prosecutor Fitch, call your first witness. Thomas Fitch, the federal prosecutor, was a wiry man with fierce eyes and a reputation for never losing. He stood and buttoned his jacket with theatrical precision. The territory calls Miss Sarah Mitchell Thornton. Sarah stood, smoothed her dress, and walked to the witness stand. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, her voice steady and clear. Fitch approached with a gentle expression. Mrs. Thornton, please tell the court what happened on the 10th of July, 1883. Sarah took a breath and began. She told them about the school where she taught, about Cross's persistent courtship, about his public proposal and her public refusal. She told them about being kidnapped, about Cross tying her to a wooden cross in the desert, about 2 days without water or shade. The courtroom was utterly silent. Even the newspaper men had stopped scribbling, caught up in the horror of her story. "And then what happened?" Fitch prompted. "Then Jake Thornton found me, cut me down, saved my life." "What did you do after Mr. Thornton rescued you?" This was the dangerous part. Sarah glanced at Jake, drew strength from his presence, and spoke clearly. "I made him an offer. I told him that if he would protect me from Mr. Cross, I would give myself to him 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night." The courtroom erupted. People gasped, whispered, pointed. Judge Barnes had to bang his gavel 3 times to restore order. "Why did you make such an offer?" Fitch asked. "Because I had nothing else to trade," Sarah said simply. "No money, no property, no family who could protect me. All I had was my body, and I chose to offer it to a good man rather than let a monster take it by force. That was my choice, my decision, my right." "Did Mr. Thornton force you?" "No, he told me I didn't owe him anything, that he would protect me regardless. But I wanted to keep my promise, not because I had to, but because I chose to." Cross's lead lawyer, a slick man named Pendleton, stood for cross-examination. He smiled at Sarah like a wolf eyeing a sheep. "Mrs. Thornton, isn't it true that you're a woman of questionable morals? That you offered yourself sexually to a man you barely knew?" "I offered myself to a man who saved my life," Sarah corrected. "And there's nothing questionable about choosing survival." "But you admit you engaged in relations with Mr. Thornton?" "I admit I made love to my husband, yes. He wasn't your husband then. He is now, and the church married us with full knowledge of our circumstances." Pendleton changed tactics. "Mrs. Thornton, my client says you fabricated this entire story, that you and Mr. Thornton conspired to extort money from him. Your client is a liar." "Objection!" Pendleton shouted. "Sustained," Judge Barnes said. "Mrs. Thornton, please stick to answering the questions asked." "I'm sorry, Your Honor, but I will not sit here and let that man's lawyer rewrite history. Nathaniel Cross tied me to a cross and left me to die. That's not fabrication. That's truth." Pendleton tried for another hour to break her, to find contradictions in her story, to make her seem like a scheming temptress. But Sarah held firm, answering every question with calm precision. Finally frustrated, Pendleton said, "No further questions." Sarah stepped down from the witness stand. As she passed Cross's table, he leaned forward and whispered just loud enough for her to hear, "Whore." Sarah stopped, turned, and looked down at him. "I'd rather be a whore who chose her own fate than a slave to your ego." The courtroom gasped. Judge Barnes banged his gavel. "Mrs. Thornton, that's enough." But Sarah had made her point. She walked back to her seat beside Jake with her head high, and when she sat down, Jake took her hand and squeezed it tight. "I'm proud of you," he whispered. Next came Jake's testimony. He corroborated Sarah's story, added details about the attacks on his ranch, the poisoned cattle, the burned house. He showed the court his medical bills, his property assessments, evidence of the financial damage Cross had caused. Pendleton tried the same tactics on Jake, but they bounced off like arrows off armor. Jake had been questioned by Apache warriors with knives at his throat. A lawyer in a nice suit held no fear for him. "Mr. Thornton, isn't it true you took advantage of a vulnerable woman?" "No, sir. I protected a woman who'd been victimized by your client. You had sexual relations with her before marriage. I made love to a woman who chose me freely, just like you probably do with your wife. The only difference is we were honest about it." The courtroom laughed. Even Judge Barnes cracked a smile. Daniel Mitchell testified next, bringing the loan documents that proved Cross's fraud. A handwriting expert confirmed that the interest rate had been altered after signing. A chemist testified that 2 different types of ink had been used, applied at different times. Then came the survivors. Thomas Reed and Margaret Flynn, 2 people Cross had left in the desert years before. Both were scarred by the experience, emotionally and physically. But both spoke clearly about Cross's cruelty, his belief that he could do whatever he wanted to whomever he wanted. Marshall Garrett testified about the final battle, about Cross giving the order to burn Jake's house, about the men killed in the assault. The two captured deputies who turned state's evidence testified that Cross had ordered them to kill Jake and Sarah if they didn't surrender. The evidence piled up like stones on a grave. By the end of the second week, it was clear to everyone in the courtroom that Cross was guilty. But Cross's lawyers weren't done. They called character witnesses who swore Cross was a pillar of the community. They brought financial records showing his charitable donations. They painted him as a successful businessman targeted by a scheming woman and a jealous rival. It was all smoke and mirrors, but smoke and mirrors could sometimes confuse a jury. On the third week of trial, Prosecutor Fitch called his final witness, a surprise that even Garrett hadn't mentioned. The territory calls Maria Delgado. An elderly Mexican woman walked to the stand, moving slowly with the aid of a cane. She looked terrified but determined. "Mrs. Delgado, please tell the court about your daughter." The old woman's voice shook but held. "My daughter, she'll work for Mr. Cross, as maid. She's 17. Beautiful girl, smart. What happened to her?" "Mr. Cross, Maria paused, gathered herself. "He forced himself on her, many times. She tried to tell Sheriff. Sheriff do nothing. Say Mr. Cross is important, man. Who believe poor Mexican girl?" "What happened to your daughter?" Fitch asked gently. "She kill herself, cannot live with shame. She only 17. The courtroom went dead silent. Even Pendleton looked shaken. "When did this happen?" Fitch asked. 5 years ago, 1878. "Why didn't you come forward before?" "I afraid. Mr. Cross, he have power. I just old woman. Who listened to me?" Maria looked directly at Cross now, eyes blazing with decades of suppressed rage. "But when I hear what he do to another girl, I think, enough, no more. He need to pay." Cross's face had gone white. Pendleton jumped up. "Objection. This is completely irrelevant, not part of the charges." "It goes to pattern of behavior," Fitch countered. "Shows a history of victimizing vulnerable women." Judge Barnes thought for a long moment. "I'll allow it. The jury may consider this testimony when evaluating Mr. Cross's character." The defense tried to recover. They brought rebuttal witnesses who'd known Cross's maid and claimed she'd been mentally unstable. They suggested Maria was lying for attention or money. But the damage was done. The jury had seen the pattern. Young women. Vulnerable women. Women Cross thought he could control. Sarah wasn't his first victim. She was just the first to survive and fight back. Closing arguments took 2 days. Pendleton painted Cross as a victim of circumstance, a successful man brought down by those who envied him. Fitch painted him as a predator who thought his money put him above the law. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict. "We find the defendant, Nathaniel Cross, guilty on all 7 counts." The courtroom exploded. People cheered. Cross's lawyers shouted objections. Sarah burst into tears. Jake held her while she cried, his own eyes wet. Judge Barnes banged his gavel until order was restored. Then he looked at Cross with cold contempt. "Nathaniel Cross, you have been found guilty of murder, attempted murder, fraud, arson, and assault. This court has heard testimony about your character, your crimes, and your complete lack of remorse. It is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to death by hanging, to be carried out in 2 weeks' time." Cross finally broke. "This is injustice. I'm a businessman. She was supposed to be mine." "People are not property, Mr. Cross. You never learned that lesson in life. You'll learn it in death." Barnes banged his gavel one final time. "This court is adjourned." As deputies led Cross away in chains, he looked back at Sarah one last time. Not with rage now, with something like incomprehension. As if even facing death, he couldn't understand how a woman had defeated him. Sarah held Jake's hand and watched him go. She felt no triumph, no joy, just a deep, bone-tired relief that it was finally over. Outside the courthouse, Daniel embraced his daughter. "I'm proud of you, Sarah, so proud." "We did it together, Papa." "No," Daniel said firmly. "You did it. You were the brave one. I was just following your lead." Marshal Garrett shook hands with Jake and Sarah. "You two are going to be famous. The newspapers are already writing stories. The woman who defied the desert baron. That sort of thing." "I don't want fame," Sarah said. "I just want to go home." "Then go home," Garrett said with a smile. You've earned it. 2 weeks passed. Jake and Sarah stayed in Tucson, waiting. On a cold October morning, word came that Nathaniel Cross had been hanged at dawn in the prison courtyard. They did not attend the execution. Some endings didn't need witnessing. Marshal Garrett visited their hotel that afternoon. "It's done," he said simply. "Cross died badly, crying, begging. The guard said he kept asking for you, Sarah, kept saying you belonged to him, even with the noose around his neck." Sarah felt nothing, no triumph, no satisfaction, just emptiness where fear used to live. "Good," she said. "Now we can go home." They left Tucson the next morning, riding into the sunrise. 3 days back to the ranch, to the land that was theirs, to the future they'd fought for. But they weren't going back to ruins. While they'd been in Tucson, something unexpected had happened. The people of Wilcox, ashamed that they'd let Cross terrorize their neighbors for so long, had organized a barn raising. When Jake and Sarah rode up to their property, they found 30 men working on a new house. Not as big as the old one, but solid and well-built. The frame was already up, the roof halfway done. A man named Peterson, who ran the general store, approached with a wide grin. "Figure you folks earned yourselves a new start. We're paying our debts." Jake was speechless. Sarah cried again, but these were good tears. They pitched in to help, and by the end of October, the house was finished. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a parlor with a fireplace. Nothing fancy, but it was home. Daniel stayed on, helping to rebuild the herd with cattle he purchased using money he'd saved over the years. The 3 of them worked the ranch together, a family forged by fire. In December, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. Jake wept when she told him. After Rebecca, after 10 years alone, he'd given up on ever being a father. Now, at 48 years old, he was getting a second chance at everything. "We're going to name her Ruth if it's a girl," Sarah decided. "Offer Ruth from the Bible, the woman who chose her own family. And if it's a boy, Jacob, of course, after the man who saved my life." Their daughter Ruth was born in August of 1884, delivered by the same midwife who'd attended half the births in Wilcox. She came into the world screaming, red-faced and furious, and Jake fell in love instantly. He held her in his massive, scarred hands and marveled at how small she was. How perfect. How miraculous. "She has your eyes," Sarah said from the bed, exhausted but happy. "And your fighting spirit," Jake replied. "Listen to those lungs." Daniel stood in the doorway smiling. "I'm a grandfather, never thought I'd live to see it." The first year with Ruth was chaos. Sleepless nights, constant worry, the terror that something might happen to this tiny person they'd brought into the world. But it was also joy beyond anything Jake had imagined. Every smile, every small achievement felt like a miracle. Sarah proved to be a natural mother. Patient, loving, but also practical. She taught Ruth to be strong from day one, to face the world without fear. "She's going to grow up knowing she can choose her own path," Sarah told Jake. "No one will ever own her. No one will ever make her feel powerless." "Damn right," Jake agreed. Daniel Mitchell lived to see his granddaughter Ruth turn 14. In 1898, at age 66, he died quietly in his sleep in the small room they'd built for him off the kitchen. They found him in the morning, peaceful, a photograph of Sarah's mother clutched in his hand. They buried him in Wilcox Cemetery beside his late wife, not under the oak tree. That place was reserved for the 3 who'd fought together. But Jake carved Daniel's headstone with the same care he'd given Miguel's. Daniel Mitchell, father, grandfather, a man who found his courage. Ruth cried at the funeral. Sarah held her and whispered, "Your grandfather wasn't perfect, but he learned, and that's all any of us can do." The years passed. The ranch prospered. Word of their story spread, and people came from all over to see the place where a woman had defied a tyrant. Some came out of curiosity. Others came looking for hope, for proof that the powerful could be defeated. Jake and Sarah welcomed them all, told their story honestly, leaving nothing out. The good, the bad, the complicated parts that didn't fit into neat moral categories. In 1900, when Ruth was 16, she asked her father about that famous promise, the 3 times a day thing that everyone whispered about. Jake was 65 then, still strong but feeling his age. He and Ruth were mending fence together when she asked, "Papa, is it true what they say, that Mama offered herself to you?" Jake set down his tools and looked at his daughter. She had Sarah's green eyes and fierce spirit, had grown into a young woman who feared nothing. "It's true," he said. "Your mother was dying in the desert. I saved her. She offered me the only thing she had left, her body 3 times a day, in exchange for protection. Did you take advantage of her?" I asked her that same question every day for 2 weeks, and every while she told me the same thing. It was her choice, her decision, her way of taking control when a man had tried to steal all her choices. Jake looked at Ruth seriously. "Your mother is the strongest person I've ever known. She made a deal to serve him, then turned it into love. That's not weakness. That's power." Ruth nodded slowly. "I want to be like her." "You already are." Sarah lived to see her grandchildren. Ruth married a good man, a rancher named Thomas, who reminded Jake of himself at that age. They had 3 children, and Sarah spoiled them all shamelessly. She died in 1920, age 62, of pneumonia. It happened fast, just like Rebecca. One day she was fine, the next she was struggling to breathe, and 3 days later, she was gone. Jake held her hand as she died. She was still beautiful to him, gray hair and wrinkles and all. Still the fierce woman he'd found tied to a cross 37 years ago. "No regrets," she whispered with her last strength. "None," Jake agreed, "not a single one." "Tell our story, Jake. Tell the children. Tell them that love is a choice, not an accident. And choosing is the bravest thing anyone can do." "I promise." Sarah closed her eyes and was gone. Jake buried her next to Miguel under the oak tree. The tree was massive now, its shade deep and cool. All the people Jake loved, together in death as they'd been in life. He lived 3 more years, long enough to see his great-grandson Thomas born, long enough to tell his story one more time, to pass on the lessons he'd learned. On a hot afternoon in July 1923, 40 years almost to the day since he'd found Sarah in the desert, Jake sat on his porch with young Thomas and told him everything. About the cross, about the promise, about Miguel and Cross and the battle that had nearly killed them all, about love found in the worst circumstances and turned into something beautiful. "Why are you telling me this?" Thomas asked. "Because you were going to leave, run off to the city looking for easy money. But I want you to understand something before you go." Jake looked at the land, the house, the graves under the oak. "This place isn't valuable because of the dirt or the buildings. It's valuable because of what happened here. Because people fought and died and loved here. Because your great-grandmother chose freedom over slavery, and that choice echoed down through generations. So you want me to stay? I want you to understand what you're walking away from. This isn't just land, it's legacy, it's story. It's proof that ordinary people can stand up to monsters and win. If you leave, you're not just leaving a ranch, you're leaving a piece of history." Thomas was quiet for a long time. Then he unpacked his bag and stayed. Jake died 2 years later, 90 years old in his sleep. Ruth found him in the morning, peaceful in his bed, a slight smile on his weathered face, as if, at the end, he'd seen Sarah waiting for him. They buried him between Sarah and Miguel under the oak tree. 3 people who changed each other's lives. 3 people who chosen courage when fear would have been easier. The ranch stayed in the family. Thomas ran it, then his children, then his children's children. The story passed down through generations, evolving but never losing its core truth. In the house, hanging above the fireplace, was a wooden plaque Jake had carved years before. Visitors always asked about it. The inscription read, "3 times a day was the promise, but love was the choice, and choice is what makes us free." Below it, in smaller letters, "In memory of Sarah Mitchell Thornton, who chose life, chose love, and taught us all what courage looks like." The story of Jake and Sarah became legend in Arizona. Books were written. Historians debated the details. Feminists claimed Sarah as a pioneer of bodily autonomy. Religious groups condemned her as immoral. But the family who lived on that land, who tended those graves, who carried that story in their blood, they knew the truth. Sarah hadn't been perfect. Neither had Jake. They'd made a deal born of desperation, turned it into love through choice and time, and shared struggle. They'd survived when survival seemed impossible. And in surviving, they'd proven something that every generation needs to learn anew. That dignity can't be taken, only surrendered. That love is stronger than fear. That sometimes the most radical thing you can do is choose your own path, regardless of what the world says you should do. The oak tree still stands today, over 100 years old, its roots deep in Arizona soil. 3 headstones rest in its shade. 3 people who learned that freedom, like love, is not given. It's chosen. Every day, every moment, every single time.